Well, welcome to those that have just joined us for Greg's talk. It's a great pleasure that we've got Greg to come and give this talk. We've always wanted to come and see his garden, but Greg has been very reticent about agreeing to allowing us to do it. So this is a big opportunity for us all to see the things that he's sort of titillated us by putting things on Facebook and Instagram, so we know a little bit about what he does, and we're in awe of the unusual things that he attempts to grow in Canberra. So thank you, Greg, for agreeing to do this. We know you're multi-talented in so many areas for garden history. You've given talks for us. You've been a bus captain when we've had our conference here, and you've stood up for the National Management Committee by agreeing to hold the first ever photo competition for the organisation, with the results to be announced at the AGM of the national group in November. So thank you so much for, and not to mention all the food that you prepare when we have events as well. So thank you very much for doing this talk, and we're really looking forward to hearing about your garden in this COVID year. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Margie. So while COVID has affected us all, 2020 for Canberrans was a year of multiple calamities. And like many in this city, we were fortunate to have a garden in which to live and breathe. And in case anyone who's tuned in thinking this talk was about growing the COVID virus in petri dishes, you'll see I've changed the title of my talk on the advice of my younger son, Sam. So we've lived in Riverina on the lowest slopes of Galactus, which is Black Mountain, for more than 25 years, in a home that was built in 1968. And this aerial view shows the suburb in 1968, with the red arrow showing where our house was built. And you can see the Aranda Primary School under construction. And for those of you who know the Cafe 2 before 10, it's just off to the left of the screen here. So tonight there isn't any time for detail, but rather an overview of the garden and the visual cavalcade of the plants that I grow and love. From our home, we have a rear window views of the borrowed landscape across to Mount Ainslie and the Telstra Tower. The dotted red line shows the fence line of our neighbour next door. Our climate is cool temperate. Rainfall averages 50 mils per month, supplemented by watering, with temperatures between -7 some mornings in winter, up to over 40 degrees in summer. Our gardening parameters include a hillside location at an elevation of 660 metres, which is over 2,000 feet. The garden slopes from northwest to southeast, with replant and remnant eucalypt forests threading through the suburb, an arboreal connection to Galactus. Mature trees in the garden and on the uphill neighbour's side give shade and shelter from morning and late afternoon sun and some wind and frost protection, but they also suck up water. The garden is based on initially shallow soils over rocky clay, with some sandy soil imported by the first owner in 1969, gradually being built up through mulch, imports, etc. Low retaining walls demark levels, and some swale-like crushed brick paths catch rain and sprinkler water.
There's a little frost and snow.
Snow is very rare. We do get frosts between late April and early November. The garden structure has evolved slowly, with a circle garden in the lower part of the backyard that was begun from scratch in around 2000, and an upper lawn area, which you can see just the edge of here, with the vegetable garden over to your right. Summer 2019 was very hot and unbearably smoky from bushfires to the east. The young ringtail possums in the hanging basket spent the day nestled in a hanging basket outside our back door. Too hot, I guess, for the usual hollow in the tree next door. Despite the heat, I was enjoying the flowers of the blue poppy, this delphinium species, and Anthruscus raven's wing, and looking forward to collecting their seed. Alas, that was not to be. So we started the year with smoke haze, sheltering indoors, and some of you who saw the slideshow before the talk will have seen pictures of that. Sheltering indoors with air purifiers and wearing masks, a hailstorm on January the 20th, and then the start of COVID epidemic, followed by lockdown and various restrictions. The wind and hail decimated our garden, stripping leaves from trees, flattening favoured plants and damaging over 250 roof tiles, but delivering 50 mils of rain and hail to soak into the ground. Most spring bulbs were already dormant, and many of my rare plant seedlings were spared with a covering of stripped leaves and hail. The garden recovered from the devastation and defoliation, and we spent our COVID year at home and in the garden more. This is an early morning October view from our dining room window, with the tulips finished and spring growth abundant. At the bottom of the garden, the Chinese elm is just starting to flush. Note the Cousonia paniculata, which is leaning across from our garden into the neighbours, and the two tall gum trees, the yellow box in the neighbours and the red box in our garden. This view shows the circle garden at ground level, looking towards the elm tree, which is near the back fence. And here we have the opposite view, looking back towards the house, lit up by the sun. The topiaries are clipped variegated box. On coldest mornings, the surface of the lily pot, which sits in the middle of that circle garden, sometimes freezes, but the yellow-flowered Chinese water lily is unfazed. And in warm weather, it's a favoured bathing spot for larger birds. My garden has an overall colour scheme favouring yellows and orange, with browns, blue, purple and red highlights. And in the style favoured by the late Christopher Lloyd of Great Dixter in the UK, and continued by their head gardener Fergus Garrett, I tried to have successional plantings with new flowers or foliage colours emerging as others fade. Here's a view of the upper back garden taken from the dining room window. Note we still have a hill hoist. This oak leaf hydrangea has yellow foliage, and it's a great performer all through the year. The Japanese maple came as a seedling from the Kipak shops in about 1996. Here's some views in the upper garden. This digitalis, which flowers around Christmas time, it's semi-perennial. This is a view looking from the upper garden down across the lower garden into the neighbour's garden beyond. This is an autumn view. Some of the plantings around a large pot in the upper garden. This is the Rosa mutabilis, just finishing flowering. And this is witch hazel gelina in autumn colour. Just behind it and closer to the fence is this abutlon, the Sydney bell, which I cut back every spring, and it grows up to screen compost bins and the side fence. This is an early view of the roadside garden. Our street doesn't have footpaths, and the original owner had this garden here. These are some of the plantings that I made when we first moved here. Many of these things died, including the pocket handkerchief tree, the standard rose, and this gum tree was removed by the ACT government because it was leaning towards the house. This is this view of the same garden taken in November last year. Looking over across to the neighbour's place, they have a row of gum trees which also cast shade on the garden late in the afternoon. Interesting plants include this yellow-leaved elderberry. I cut that right back in winter, so it just grows up again through summer, providing colour foliage contrast. This is the rose buff beauty, very reliable. And this is Clematis gypsy queen. Had I known a little more about the area, I probably wouldn't have planted that there when I did in 1996. Nevertheless, it still grows well. So in the remaining time of my talk, I'm going to just focus a little bit about sourcing and growing plants and some of the unusual plant groups that I grow. Since I was a teenager, I've ordered plants and seeds by mail, in addition to propagating and saving seed myself, as well as shopping locally. With COVID, increasing reliance on mail order suppliers. Thankfully for us here in Canberra, Bunnings was still open in 2020, but now we're getting used to click and collect. These are just two examples, bulbs from Tonkins, and I think Jane Tonkin might be on this talk tonight. Welcome, Jane. These are plants of Tasmania Nursery. They're also a good supplier of interesting plants. I'm a member of the Horticulture Society of Canberra, which was established in 1929. They have monthly talks with plant raffles, flower shows in spring and autumn, and a good source of local knowledge about things to grow in Canberra. In the last few years, I've also joined the Alpine and Rock Garden Plant Clubs and participated in seed distributions while carefully following the Australian quarantine permitted seed rules. This has been a great way to obtain seed of uncommon bulbs after encouragement from the late plantsman Marcus Harvey of Hillview Rare Plants in Tasmania, who first suggested to me to try growing bulbs from seed. I grow a range of plants in shady spots as well, moving them as necessary to get sun or shade. This is a spring display against our neighbour's side fence. Included here is a Nothofagus species, Cunninghamii. That's been growing several years in a pot. I find also that the heucheras grow better in pots than they do in the ground. And of course, some of the wonderful coluses provide interest in summer as well. I also grow a lot of bulbs in pots where they survive better than in the ground, and many are dormant over summer, reducing the need for care and watering. This one is the Nerine Imp. Another view of some of the Nerine cultivars that we grow. They flower in autumn. There's quite a range of colour in them. It's hard to keep track of the names of the varieties, however. We also grow quite a few species of cyclamen. They flower through autumn and winter, and many self-sow. I've got some going in the garden, but I grow a lot in pots as well. Primulas. The two primulas in the upper part are bog-type primulas, and I grow them in standing water. That way they thrive quite well in shade right through summer, and they die back in autumn, coming back again in spring. The primulas lower screen also die back over winter and flower in spring. They all like to be held in sources of water, and they like a bit of deep shade on sunny days. I also grow the auricular forms of primula, though only some cultivars seem to tolerate my haphazard care. This was a seedling I grew from mixed seed, and I named it after the US Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who died last spring. She used to favour these collars on her robes, and I thought that both the colour purple and the lace around the centre there was a good tribute to her. Japanese maple, Japanese anemones, of course, are quite widely grown. That's the Japanese anemone here in the middle. In general, anemones are woodlanders, and some flower in spring, disappearing as the weather warms up, while others flower into autumn. Most of these here are spring flowering anemones, and I think a lot of them deserve to be more widely grown. These two are creeping rhizome types. These are more discrete types. I'm growing them in pots. In addition to the traditional spring ranunculus, I grow some ranunculus species. This is Ranunculus cordacifolia. It's a favourite because it propagates easily from seed. It dies back in the hot weather, and it grows 1 to 2 metres tall with these groups of bright yellow flowers. The two on the right are both Australian species. The upper one, the Paceus, occurs on mountaintops all the way up into far north Queensland. It seeds fairly readily in the garden as well. The lower one likes moist conditions, and it's one of those creeping types. One of the favourite flowers, I guess because it's always a little bit tricky to grow, is the winter aconite. I'm growing it in pots, but it's now becoming established in parts of the garden. And I collect and sow the seed in late spring. They come up the following year around the time that the plants in the garden are beginning to flower. I also have seedlings of named cultivars, including this pale yellow form, which flowered for the first time this spring. The German name translates as sulphurous luster or Schwefelglanz. And on the right are 1 and 2 year old seedlings of the winter aconites. They usually start flowering in the 3rd year. So growing things from seed can be quite a time investment. Snowdrops. The Galactus mostly flower through late winter and into spring. However, there's also the autumn flowering Galactus, such as this one in the centre, which is named after Queen Olga of Greece. I've got a good patch of the larger growing Galactus lusii established in the garden. And these are some of the cultivars which I have growing in pots. Of course, in Europe, particularly the UK, growing Galactus is a very favoured activity amongst some gardeners. This shows 2 species which I'm growing in the ground, and again another shot of one of these yellow forms. This is called spindle stone surprise. Fritillarias. I wonder if the idea of tessellated tiles came from people seeing these Turk's caps in nature. I wonder if it inspired some of the early tile makers in the patterns of their floors and walls. I lost several in the early years when I planted them into the garden, particularly in those years of drought and when I was travelling a lot. Growing the tall species such as the Crown Imperial is more of a challenge, and I haven't yet tried it in the ground. Here's a few of some of the other species I have flowered, mostly in pots, and I have some other seedlings of other species as well that have yet to flower. Growing from seed is time consuming, but you end up with a lot more plants. The Moreas come from South Africa, and they're more tolerant of our hot summer, and some species flower in spring, including the one on the left, Velosa. This yellow one, Fugax, flowers a little bit later into summer. It's especially floriferous, just a magnificent number of flowers coming out of one small pot of plants. Late summer, early autumn bulbs like these seem to like a good soaking, simulating the beginning of the rainy season. The amaryllis or naked ladies are very drought hardy. I grow some of them in the footpath garden, but they don't flower for me every year. I'm establishing some of the new colour types, such as this white one. The plant on the left is the oxblood lily. It also likes to have good soaking for a few days to persuade it that it's time to emerge and flower. A couple of the shrubs, a little bit uncommon, at least for Canberra. This frost tender solanum relative, Lysianthes ratonetii, it used to actually be a solanum, is marginally hardy, and when we get enough rain, it gives a wonderful display of flowers, and I usually cut the foliage back in late spring and let it grow away again. The one on the right is a West Australian native, the Yanchep rose or Diplolania angustifolia. It's grafted onto a rootstock, a more hardy phytophthora resistant rootstock. I'm growing that in a pot. It's also very much liked by wattlebirds who sometimes damage the foliage trying to get at the flowers. I have been known to stand a garden seat beside the bush so that the wattlebird can sit on the railing of the garden seat while it has a go at the flowers. Various Australian ground orchids are becoming more available, particularly through Andy's Rare Plants, who has stalls usually at the Clarendon Plant Fair in Western Sydney in autumn. I've been growing quite a few species of greenhoods. This is actually also our local species, also some of the bird orchids and the diurus as well. This one we see in our bushland as well. They're all a little bit frost tender, so I like to have them with a little bit of shelter from some foliage through winter. Peonies. They do fairly well here with the feed of dolomite in winter and also a good dressing of blood and bone in spring. This yellow one, Stardust, is a grafted tree peony. In general, I found a lot of these grafted ones a bit more temperamental for my lackadaisical care. This tree peony has survived for 25 years in the garden. I sometimes chop it back to ground level when I remember in time, because it then will come away with a new lot of shoots. On the left is one of the more herbaceous species which flowered for me the first time last spring. Quite a nice performer. And here's some seedlings of various other species that I'm growing that I've yet to flower. I like to grow some of these smaller Australian natives and increase them in the garden. I found that growing the Christmas bell by having the pot in standing water, it seems to be a good way of growing it. It likes to have a little bit of moisture. The Riverina from Tasmania is also performing well for me. I've had it now for a few years in quite a large pot, and I've also got a second generation of seedlings flowering. Things like bluebells and some of these Tasmanian alpines I also try to grow. This is just a shot of a few of the more uncommon plants I'm growing, including this creeping nasturtium, this parsley family member, Haquatia, this rudbeckia, which is a little bit more less commonly grown. I really like the way it grows quite tall, flowering in summer. Trout lilies also grow. They're a little bit too seedy, coming up in pots. And Codonopsis, a group of creepers, which are interesting to grow as well. On the left, we have Delphinium menzii. I mentioned it earlier on. It dies back to small rhizomes in late summer. I haven't yet managed to collect seed, but I'm hoping to. And I have 3 other Delphinium species growing from seed this year, so it'll be interesting to see how they go. On the right is a Ganera species from Tasmania. Many of you will be familiar with the giant forms that come from South America. This is a very diminutive form. It likes moist conditions and is a bit frost tender. On the right, there's a list of some of the suppliers I've used, present and past. Some of them are now closed. That gives you an idea of where some of my plants have come from. I'd also like to give a shout out to Shanta from Bollygum Gardens, who helps in the garden here for 2 hours every fortnight. Thanks, Shanta. I think you're listening tonight. And of course, bittersweet memories of our COVID year. My dad passed away in August. So we're almost finished. I'd like to thank my friends, relatives who've joined, including some friends from overseas, Dr. To, Guang Lin, Shazia. Thank you particularly for joining in from overseas. And it's been great, but a little bit tricky talking as if I'm talking to nobody. I hope you're enjoying the talk. And thank you for your generous contributions to the UNICEF collection as well.